welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author, an author who has been here before. This is the second visit, and once you are here twice, you are a friend of the show. So welcome, friend of the show, to discuss an absolutely gorgeous and fascinating sci-fi novel. I was so fascinated reading this, and I am so excited to talk about it. So long rambling intro. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Maria Dong, and I'm the author of PSYCHOPOMP, which is the book we'll be talking about today, as well as Liar, Dreamer, Thief, which you can find on a previous episode of this show. I mostly write science fiction and fantasy, although Liar, Dreamer, Thief is a thriller. I have a lot of short fiction out there if you're looking for some freebies, including two pieces that were in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. I was a finalist for the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award for a piece called In the Beginning of Me, I Was a Bird. So that's a fun one to check out if you're looking for a flavor. But today we'll be talking about PSYCHOPOMP, which is a science fiction novel from Dark Matter Inc. that just came out.
Oh, it is so good. And congratulations on the publication and just oh my gosh, it is so beautiful. I'm really curious about the ways in which, as you have just mentioned, there is a genre shift in between Liar, Dreamer, Thief and this book. Yet there are a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of themes and some of your concerns, like as a writer. So can you talk about like what was new for you here and what was sort of you feel like is part of like your oeuvre as it exists?
Yeah, so I think one thing that people don't realize when they see the order that books come out in is that it's usually, or maybe not, I shouldn't say usually, but it's often not the order that authors write books in, because there are a lot of there's a lot of negotiation around contracts. So, for example, if you have like a series, they don't want the books in that series to come out too soon between each other. If you have books at multiple publishers, if you're in different genres, so there are like all these considerations. And that's just saying that like if you manage to sell them all, which my books tend to sell out of order apparently, because I wrote this book back in 2018 before I even had my agent. And it was one of the first projects. It was not the first project, but one of the first projects my agent and I went out with, actually. And then I actually wound up writing Liar, Dreamer, Thief 2 books later. But that was the first book to sell. I think partially because of the genre difference, right? That one feels a little more commercial. It's in that like thriller space, which is a bigger space commercially. There are more publishers that do that. Science fiction is probably one of the smallest spaces. And as far as genre, there's like 4, maybe 5 major publishers that will touch science fiction, like true science fiction. If it's got a little bit of speculative to it, but it's not like in space, there's like there are more avenues for it. So but yeah, I think it has a lot in common with my previous book. Like both books are definitely going to be for people that are maybe more on the anti-capitalist side of things, I guess is how I would put that. Like, I think my politics are part of me and part of my writing. And so I don't think you can really separate those. They both have a female narrator who I think it's interesting because like people talking about my writing often call them unreliable, but I think to the narrators themselves, they're reporting their experience as true as they can, right? They're not playing any tricks on the reader. What you see is what she sees for both books, right? So I guess they're unreliable people and reliable narrators in that context. They're both very surreal. I think, they kind of there's a lot of like what is real and what is not real going on at any time. And I think that's kind of like something I like to play in that space a lot because when I look at most of the books I've written, they have at least some aspect of that going on. So I think there's some commonalities there for sure. And then both books obviously have like a big mystery element to them. I actually thought this book was just like a mystery. And then when we went on submission, the reception was like, no, it's probably not in that space. So I was like, oh, okay, good to know. So, yeah.
Interesting. And I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of unreliable or reliable narrators because that was sort of one of my points. When it does, really lean into the sort of the mystery elements, it occurred to me that she is an extremely reliable narrator to us, but her brain is not necessarily narrating reality to her in a reliable way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's something I like to play with a lot in general, because I mean, I don't know if you have a background where you learn about like neurology or like how our brains process sensory information. The truth is like nobody's interpretation of the world is 100% reliable, right? And then everything on top of that gets filtered in through our brain and our cognition. So we assign meaning to all of the different sensory pieces. So it's like if you've ever driven down the road, for example, and you've seen a shadow, and for a moment you're like 100% convinced it's like a deer in the road. And then, 2 seconds later, the shadows shift and you realize it's just like a paper bag or something, right? All of our experiences of the world are not actually reliable, right? And like, I think many of us need the feeling that it is a reliable one-to-one correlation to like exist in our world and be comfortable. But for those of us who have brains that maybe go haywire every so often, like we kind of have to exist in the space of knowing all of the time that our brain is not necessarily the most reliable reporter. I hope I'm explaining this well because I didn't think about this concept before we started this conversation, like how I was going to explain it. So that's on me. So yeah, I think that so a lot of my narrators exist in that space where they kind of know their brain maybe isn't the most reliable, right? And so like when they have information come in, their first instinct is to like start questioning it or trying to reality test it. Like, did I actually see this? Is this actually there? Does anyone else see this? Is there any other evidence that this is happening? Because they know that their brain isn't necessarily going to be giving them the information that someone else might find in that circumstance.
I spent a lot of time thinking about that because, yeah, I think the idea that your reception of reality is not at a one-to-one with what's actually happening or with what you're actually seeing can be terrifying to people. I have at times found it to be very comforting because sometimes your eyes and your ears are telling you terrible things, and the idea that that
Yeah.
might not be true is a source of relief at times. And so I think that, like, yeah, there's something really fascinating with being comfortable with the idea that your senses are not necessarily telling you 100% the truth.
Yeah, and also that your first assumption about a situation isn't necessarily the correct one, right? That's something that a lot of us, I think me personally, for example, all the time should utilize more often, right? That the first assumption that you make based on what you see isn't necessarily the one that you should go with or act on. But yeah, so that's just something that I'd like to think about and explore quite a bit.
Let's talk a little bit more about pumps. So literally, I'm not lying to you. Psychopomp is on my list of favorite words. I have a list of
Oh,
my phone and it's on there. So could you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a pomp on Hibiscus Station?
yeah. Okay. So this kind of goes to that question of like what we were just talking about as far as sensory information and what is real and not real. So the world building, which some people have called or emailed to let me know that it's not the most accurate scientifically. And I find that interesting because if you read the book, like I don't think it's striving for scientific accuracy in general. Like there are some things that happen toward the end that take it very far into the almost fantastical space, right? And I as an artist, I almost always like find that the world building has to serve the character and the theme versus, the other way around. So if something, maybe quite doesn't match and I need to change it to make it serve that purpose better, like I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that immediately. So in this world, there is a kind of crystal which, when compressed, generates energy, which is something that actually exists in nature now. Like if you have quartz crystals, for example, and you compress them, that deformation of the crystal causes an electric charge to happen. It's not as pronounced as what's happening in this book, but it does kind of exist. And so there are these people that, because it's such a great source of energy, it's very expensive and valuable, but it's also pretty hard to get because, it's like on a moon. So these people who are in the book, it says criminals, but a lot of them are just debtors, right? So this concept of like, what is a criminal or not a criminal, right? Get sent to the moon as part of their sentence to mine these crystals out of the ground in these pretty precarious, pretty dangerous. So, but the problem is you don't actually know exactly where these crystals are going to form. There are some, like evident, there's some constellations and structures under the ground that kind of hint that this might be more accurate. And so people in the book have used a combination of like ground penetrating radar and essentially like computer programs that run kind of an odds analysis to figure out, okay, how likely is it crystal's supposed to be here? But there needs like a human touch, basically. It's almost like diagnosis. So a pomp is a person who is trained to take all of this data in and then make an educated guess or assumption about what path we should mine, where the crystal is going to be the most stable and the most lucrative. So those are the pomps, which obviously is a word that I took from the word psychopomp, right? Which is a person or animal or like some kind of spirit that guides people through the underworld, right? So it's it's obviously allegorical, but yeah, that's what the job is essentially.
And our protagonist, Young, has attempted this career. And I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about shaping Young as a character and also her history before the story starts. She's in a really interesting position where, like, she's basically unknown to everybody, but everybody knows her, who she is,
Yeah.
not much about her. So could you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, so before the book even opens, she is in this program to try to become a pomp, and she has some talent for it. But also the stress of it and the interactions that she has with some of the people that are guiding the program essentially facilitate like a mental breakdown in her. And she um, basically, and this is all before the book even starts, but she basically decides to kill herself by like walking off of the station and disconnecting all of her equipment. And then what happens is that she kind of blacks out and then she wakes back up in the station. And so she's like, okay, they came and they got me essentially because there are all these different pieces of equipment that monitor your life signs. And then also all of the people who are mining are valuable, right? They are essentially the property of the state or the corporation state in this case. And they're creating more wealth and income for that corporation state. So you can't just like walk off and do whatever you want, right? And I think one of the things that I try to write about in particularly in the opening of her character is kind of like how it feels to be somebody that either has deeply contemplated or attempted suicide and then in her words she says not been successful, but I don't think that's great terminology, so I'll say like has survived that, right? And it's a weird place to be in because we're talking about literal life and death. But if you do get to the other side of that, then you have to do things like go to work and brush your teeth. And, life is life with all of its mundane, boring little pieces. And then on top of that, you're also somebody that if other people find out about it, like everyone has an opinion on it, everyone's looking at you, everyone's kind of micro watching you to figure out, oh, are you about to blow again? Or, oh, was there a sign or something like that? So at a point in your life where you probably want to be noticed the least, you're often noticed the most. And that's such an uncomfortable place to be, right? To the point where the main character of this book, in the beginning, when that's all kind of swirling around her, she just kind of like loses her bananas and just like yells at everyone and runs away, which somebody told me that was like a really juvenile thing for her to do. And I was like, I mean, she's obviously, first of all, very young. She's under a lot of stress. She's in a space prison on the moon. So, I mean, even if her mental health was perfect going in, I doubt it's going to stay that way. So, yeah, that was something that I kind of wanted to look at and explore. It's just it's almost funny, when you're in that situation, it's like there's so much humor in it, like really dark humor about having to just go about your normal daily life and, drive through the drive-through and pick up your prescription or like whatever. It's bananas and you feel so incapable of doing all these things, but it's not like we have a system set up in our society that's like, hey, this thing just happened, and why don't you take 30 days off? And like, well, if you're rich, you do, but that's kind of part of the point, right?
That scene that you referenced is, I spent so much time thinking about it. I
Aw,
think she's incredibly justified
yeah,
in yelling and leaving because they were not being particularly nice to her. You know, her companion, her crew were sort of egging her on, asking her
yeah,
questions about her attempt. They are using a sort of jocular tone and a kind of mean one at times. But the moment that I don't even want to say snaps, but just the moment that she decides to face their questions head on and treat
yeah.
same way that they are treating it, they're like, whoa, no, that's for us to joke about. You need to be serious about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's very realistic. And I think, I mean, the people in this book, like the other characters, are like the main character, right? They're probably not coming from a background where everyone's talking about therapy terms and we all have like treating people well as an adult, I think, in some ways is a learned behavior. You learn about, oh, well, what things you should and shouldn't say, and that may be, different from context to context. But it makes me sorry, this is going to be kind of a tangent, but I've been talking to like, obviously we're having a lot of conversations on the left about things we could change and things that, we need to work on. And there's this really wonderful essay called Exiting the Vampire's Castle that's basically just about how the left is like sometimes prone to self-cannibalize because certain branches of it expect other branches to have terminology, right? To speak a certain way. And if you don't speak the right way, then you're not aligned with us. even if you're living the lived experience of somebody who, you know, honestly in your day to day is doing the work, right? Like, so you could be like a union organizer. That's someone who's very much doing the work, right? But if you're not talking about different groups of people the exact right way, instead of taking a moment and saying, okay, this is a spot for education, let's all figure out how we can like unite and you know approach this more empathetically. This is a teaching moment. We have this tendency to just like, oh, you're not as good at being a leftist and like tear each other down, right? And so I think when we look at the conversation that's happening there in the book, one thing that we have to be aware of is that contextually, like discussions around mental health is something you get to think about when your life is in a position of like relative privilege, right? My mental health got so much better the second there was more money in my bank account and I could do things like sit around instead of go to three jobs and think about, you know, what kind of person do I want to be and how do I want to talk to other people? It's very difficult to do that when you're in the day-to-day surviving. I think there's a pretty well-regarded, well-known writer named Dr. Octavia Cade who wrote a review of this book, beautiful blurb for it. But in the review, one of the things she said is that Young feels like the kind of narrator that should come out of a dystopian system, right? You everyone wants to read about this person who is like fun and inspiring and hopeful and all of these great things, but if you're in a system like this, what are the most likely outcomes in terms of how it affects your personality and the way you interact with other people, right? And so like I mean, I kind of split the difference. Like she could be meaner, but she could be nicer, you know, so it's kind of in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And the entire, my next question is sort of about like world building, but not so much sci-fi world building as penal colony world
Yeah.
building. And a really funny sort of coincidence was that I read your book last week, and then over the weekend I saw Mickey 17, and and there's really similar themes there about debt slavery too.
Oh,
And
okay.
I think the idea of going to space in order to do things that are illegal on Earth, which corporations I think would be very, very likely to do. So yeah, could you talk about like, the system of debt slavery that you have happening here on Hibiscus Station?
I haven't seen that movie, but I love Bong Joon-ho's work, like his whole body of work. I think maybe part of that is that, you know, being Korean American, but also somebody who's lived in Korea, who's both as a child and as an adult. Korea is democratic, it's capitalist, and it's a different kind of democratic capitalist than the United States, which right now, I don't want to go into the details of what I think about the United States version, but Korea has its own problems, right? Like there's a common phrase that some young people kind of throw around as like slang. It's Joseon, which Joseon's like an old dynasty in Korea that was like very structured. There, it was, you know, think about like when you think about the monarchy, for example, but the word hell in front of it, right? So, you know, it's talking about kind of the capitalist nature of the current state, particularly for young people, how that affects your ability to do things like become upwardly mobile and try new things, and like so you're just kind of stuck, right? It feels oppressive. It sounds oppressive, and I remember when I went on submission with this book. First, we went out with this Korean inspired, I guess you would call it, because it's not the mythology in the book isn't actually all from Korea. Some of it is Korean, and then some of it I made up because I'm a writer and I make things up. So, but it was a fantasy novel called Bad Moon Child. Actually, not looking at it now, I'm like, it's probably more fantasy horror. And at this time, when we went out with this novel, there weren't really any adult Korean fantasy books. And we actually went out with it twice, once as an adult novel and once as a YA novel. And the YA space, there were a couple things like, but really, I mean, this was 2018. It's amazing how much publishing changed in the space of 2018 to 2024 in terms of like particularly like what backgrounds you were seeing in the fantasy space. So we went out with this book and we got a lot of like, oh, we already have an Asian fantasy book on our roster or whatever, because, you know, there can only be one. It's like Highlander. But when we went out with Psychopomp, which in my mind also is a Korean book, right? This version of like this techno-capitalist future is in some ways like what Koreans think about when they think about what the directions the future could take, especially bad ones, right? And we got a lot of like, oh, can Maria just write another Korean book? Which I thought was really funny because this is a Korean book. That's a Korean main character. Her name is a Korean word. They're on a Korean planet with a Korean name. Like everything's Korean. But I think it's interesting that you compare it to Bong Joon-ho because in my mind, that's kind of where this book also lives, right? Like it's in conversation with some of the things that he's explored in his movies, particularly the science fiction work, right? Like Snowpiercer, which is based on I think a graphic novel that he obviously didn't write, but like that, exploring these questions of like capitalism in space, when, maybe the rules are a little bit different and what that looks like. Yeah, I'm not surprised that he's thinking about the same stuff. He probably thinks about it better, smarter, and faster than I do because he's a genius. But, yeah, so.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about through the lens of my own experience. The example, I mean, just the experience of being, I think, Young's age right now, up to, my age even, which is a little bit older. As somebody who went to an expensive school and is probably going to be paying for it for the rest of my life, like sometimes life can feel like debt slavery, which is not to say that like my life isn't massively better than what people are experiencing on Hibiscus Station, but I think it is something that is very relatable for
I
sure.
think better in some ways, but in some ways worse. Like one of the things I want to do in this book was not create a prison environment where everything just feels oppressive all of the time and it's like unilaterally like black and white, right? This is bad, this is good. The people that live on Hibiscus Station in this book, they come from places where their survival is not guaranteed, right? They're really scrapping to survive. And then they're in, quote unquote prison, and they're on the moon, and suddenly they have access to things that they don't have in the outside world, like a nice soft bed and, their own little, home. And so like one of the questions that the book is kind of playing with is this question of like, what does it look like in terms of being, I don't want to say enslaved. I want to say like almost indentured, right? Like what does that actually look like? What are the permutations that that could take? And then kind of if you think about it, if it looks like it on its surface could look more comfortable than most people think of or we see commonly depicted in fiction, how does that relate to the way we all live right now? And I think your student loan analogy is perfect because when I started writing this book, that was probably the biggest thing that influenced my mental state. I had these crushing student loans from becoming an occupational therapist, which I'm not anymore, so that's hilarious. And I had this job that was just destroying me mentally, right? I was working in this nursing home, which I could talk for hours and hours about nursing care and the effect of private capital and private equity on nursing care. And it is really, really just terrible and awful. And it's also soul destroying for the people that work in that system, unless you're a very specific kind of person who is extremely good at compartmentalizing, right? The therapists I saw that were successful in that system that, went to bed happy were people that could literally like just split their brain in half, right? And kind of they're suffering here and I'm not looking at it right now because I'm just dealing with this one piece right here. So I was not one of those people and it was destroying me. Like it was literally like my whole personality changed. I was so unhappy. Like I started, like I think I've mentioned this other places, but I started thinking about dying. Like I was like, oh, well, if I just die, then my student loans don't matter anymore, and I don't have to go to this job. So it's like a win-win. All I have to do is die, which I don't recommend. And if you find yourself in that place and you have the ability, luckily I was married, and my husband was like, maybe you should just not do this anymore. But it took us a long time to get there because we both came from relatively underprivileged back, well, at least in our 20s, we were both broke. And so like it's really scary to tell your partner, yeah, quit your job, like when you don't have another job, right? Like it took us a long time to get there. But yeah, so like that was the biggest influence on my mental state when I started drafting this novel was like all of the hours that I used to stay up really late just obsessing about it and just feeling haunted by it, or like in the morning driving, I had this really long, I had like a 45-minute commute to get to work, and it was in the dark in Michigan in the winter. And you're by yourself in this darkness that is really pervasive, right? Especially because it's not unlike the highway. It was all down these like back roads. So there was like no light. It was completely dark. And I'd be thinking about this book, and I'm sure that's like kind of why it's in the eternal dark on a moon, and why, we're talking about this idea of debt slavery, right? Like, I agree with you. I think that what we have done to, I want to say our young people, but I mean, I'm not that young. I'm 40, right? And I have loans that I'll probably never be able to pay back. And now the US government says, hey, we want to change up the term on these loans. And so, like, even though we said that you could pay them back on an income basis, now we just want them. And, there are a lot of people who are going to suffer quite a bit and just feel quite a bit of anguish over it. So, yeah, the feeling that you had when you were thinking about, oh, this kind of reminds me of, yeah, that's very intentional. Like you picked right up on it. It was there. So,
Yeah, there is something I think, particularly with the the student loan thing, no longer talking about metaphors, but the thing, we were sold, a particular generation, this idea that like, oh, your education is the most important thing. Like spend as much money as you can to get that dream job. And then like when that dream job doesn't work out, it's like, well, a job's just a job. Do that like,
Hmm.
there's all this really mixed messaging, I think, that like you receive on either end of college about like what the job, what the purpose of college is and what role a job should play in your life. Yeah, it's oof.
Yeah, and not only that, but we would be remiss not to remark upon the fact that even now, even with college costings anywhere from like 50 to 150, I mean, God, the second you give a number to it, people jump into oh, well, you could go to community college for 2 years. And like, yes, there are things you can do and things you can't do. And a lot of them depend on like the privileges that you start out with. Do you live near a good community college? Do you have family that you can live with during that time? Like, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go down that road. But what I will say is we would be remiss not to remark upon the fact that right now there's this definite movement around this idea like, well, young people don't have to go to college. Why would they waste that money? But actually, the lifetime earnings of people that go to college is still better than people that don't go to college, even with that giant debt. So it's kind of like the people that say, oh, you don't have to go to college, unless you are very, very lucky and you like, I don't know, wind up in like tech at just the right time and just the right sector, programming just the right things. Like, yeah, you can make pretty, or like HVAC or, whatever. For the vast majority of the time, like those people are still going to send their kids to college, right? Because it's still more opportunities. I have a friend who is very, very intelligent. She's actually somebody who is an agented author, so she's an extremely good writer. Like, I would say her grammar is even better than mine. And she, recently had to find a job and was really struggling because she doesn't have a college education. And most jobs, that's a very, basic barrier to entry. Like if you're going to write an email, they want you to go to college. They're not going to ask you for a writing sample. They're going to ask you if you have a college degree, which say whatever you will about how good that system is, and I personally don't think it's the greatest. Right now, it's as much as we want to say like, oh, it's your fault for spending that money. The truth is like it's still better than not going and making, what, like $1 million less over the course of your career. It's a lot of money. So yeah,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it is.
sorry, I'm on my soapbox.
No, it is a soapbox that I am on sometimes. Then a lot of times I'm under it listening. Yeah, but I think it's really interesting how that all informs not just the world, but Young's experience. And it really, I think, goes to show how the economic system under which Young is living goes hand in hand with the mental health issues that she's also experiencing. They are like inextractable from one another, as you were
Yeah.
earlier. I just think this book handles like her perspective, her really close perspective, and the world so well. And it's really,
Oh,
oh, thank you so much for coming to talk about it. It's
oh.
really, yeah.
Well, thank you for all these compliments. I don't like I don't hate it, so that's great.
So what is on your horizon? What's next for you?
I have well, I'm sure you already know this, but like usually as an author, if something's in negotiation, you can't talk about it. So I have a couple things that I'm not allowed to talk about. But one of them, I'm hoping it looks like it's going to be a thing, and that would be something more in I would almost call it like a gothic contemporary like mystery horror space.
Mhm.
So that is a negotiation currently happening that I am very like fingers crossed about. And in the vein of like, so I wrote a book about a pandemic in fantasy Korea, and then we had a pandemic while the book was on submission, so it didn't sell. And then I wrote a book where in the first draft there was a fantasy villain who was Elon Musk, and that was this book. And then this happened, right? And I was like, okay, great. Like I'm got a real what am I doing here? And so like that book that the one that I'm not supposed to talk about, but I'm kind of talking about anyway, has like a real Epstein angle to it. And then yeah, a bunch of stuff happened and I was like, oh, like I need to stop doing this. Like I really, really do. So yeah,
Maybe try, historical fiction, something that's already happened.
yeah, I have one that I would say it's like a blend between historical fiction and second world fantasy, right? It's like a semi-Victorian slash Shakespearean fantasy heist novel-ish thing. And there's a lot of stuff about labor in it. And there is a group of people who are just the Pinkertons. They call them the Pinks. And then like the Pinkerton Amazon thing happened. And I was like, I'm like, why? I don't think I'm making this I think I'm just like picking up on it as it's happening, and then like writing it down and then things get bigger over time and it's like, oh yes, actually, so
speculative fiction Simpsons, it's
Yeah. I, I would like to write something funny, but I'm not very good at that yet. So we'll see.
Well, thank you again so much for stopping by. It's been absolutely great. And listeners, I would love for you to check out Psychopomp. It's available right now out in the world, and it will be available when you hear this. So please head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for your books. All right, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.